said the wedding was the first one the county had seen in over a decade, but no one from town had been invited. The ceremony took place in the upper valley, beyond the ridge where the road ended, and the trees grew close enough to blot out the sun. There, in the clearing, a crude wooden arch had been built, wrapped not with flowers, but with strands of dried corn husks and twisted lengths of red ribbon. In the center stood a girl so small her feet barely reached the hem of her dress, pale as milk and thin as a reed, her dark hair braided tightly back from a face that was at once blank and terrified. She was 8 years old, and the man beside her was nearly 40. The onlookers, no more than a dozen, were all kin to her, though none spoke a word. Their eyes followed the preacher's lips, but their bodies stood rigid, hands folded, as if the vows were not for the bride and groom, but for all of them. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and something faintly metallic, like old blood, from the cabin behind the clearing. The family name had been in these hills for over 100 years, etched into Bibles, scratched into barn doors, and carved into rough headstones leaning under the weight of moss. Outsiders rarely heard it, and when they did, it was whispered with a kind of cautious contempt reserved for curses. The land was poor, the winters long, and the path to the nearest store so treacherous that even the mailman refused to travel it. For generations, they had kept to themselves, marrying within the bloodline not because there were no other choices, but because they believed there was no better one. The elders told the children that their blood carried something sacred, a spark God had given only to them, and that to mix it with strangers was to sped on his gift. Over time, that belief became a law no one dared to question. The bride's name was Elsie May, though even as a baby they had rarely called her that. To her family, she was simply the promised one. Her birth had been planned years before she was conceived, part of a rotation system her kin kept in a ledger so worn its pages threatened to disintegrate. Every child's future was mapped in those pages, who they would wed, when, and why. Elsie May's fate had been sealed before she could speak her first word. Her mother was her father's niece. Her father was his own mother's cousin, and the man she now stood beside at the altar was both her uncle and her grandfather. No one in the family saw this as strange. They saw it as preservation, the continuation of a legacy they feared the outside world would destroy. From the moment she could walk, Elsie May had been groomed for the role she was about to play. Her chores were light, her dresses cleaner than the other girls, but she was never allowed to wander far from the cabin. She was taught to sew, to cook, and to recite verses from the family Bible, though the words were often different from those written on the page. The book had been altered, its margins filled with cramped handwriting that turned parables into rules about obedience, purity, and loyalty to the blood. Her mother whispered to her at night that she was special, chosen, that one day she would stand in the arch and become the heart of the family. At 8, Elsie May didn't understand what that meant. She only knew it was coming. The morning of the wedding, the cabin smelled of boiled herbs and wood polish. Women moved silently from room to room, braiding her hair so tight her scalp burned, pressing a starched dress over her head, and slipping a ring of tarnished silver onto her smallest finger. The ring was too big, but they stuffed the gap with a twist of red thread, muttering about how it would fit when she was grown. Outside, the men slaughtered a goat and hung its hide near the arch, saying it would keep away bad air during the vows. No one explained what bad air meant, but Elsie May had heard them speak of it before, usually when an outsider came too close to the property. The preacher arrived just before noon, led up the path by two of the older boys. He wasn't from town. Elsie May had never seen him before. His face was gaunt, his eyes a watery blue, and he spoke with an accent that made his words sound like they were dragged over gravel. He didn't open a Bible. Instead, he unrolled a strip of parchment covered in faded ink and read from it, his voice low but firm. The vows were strange. older than anything Elsie May had ever heard, and they spoke not of love, but of duty, binding, and blood. As he read, the man beside her, the man she knew only as Uncle Warren, tightened his grip on her small hand until she winced. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. There was no music, no feast, only a quiet exchange of rings and a single kiss pressed to her forehead. The onlookers nodded, some smiling faintly, as if a great weight had been lifted. Elsie May was led back into the cabin, where she was told to sit on the bed in the upper room and wait. Downstairs, the family began to talk in low voices, their words too muffled for her to understand. She stared out the small window, watching the sun sink lower behind the ridge, feeling the threads of the ring cut lightly into her finger. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the smell of the herbs still burning in the hearth below. By nightfall, the preacher had gone. Uncle Warren's boots creaked on the stairs. Elsie May pulled her knees to her chest, unsure why the sound made her heart race. She remembered something her mother had told her once, that the wedding was only the beginning, and that after the vows came the joining. The door opened, and Warren stood in the frame, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark river. He said nothing, only stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Warren crossed the room slowly, his boots pressing into the warped floorboards with a groan that seemed louder in the small upstairs chamber. Elsie May watched him through the thin veil of her braid, the strands falling loose from where the women had tied them that morning. His breath smelled faintly of corn liquor and wood smoke, and the light from the oil lamp on the wall flickered across his face, carving deep shadows into his cheekbones. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he sat down on the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed, running one hand over its lid, as if feeling for something buried beneath the wood. When he finally met her eyes, there was no warmth there, only the flat gaze of a man fulfilling an obligation. Downstairs, the murmured voices of the family had turned into a low hum, almost like a chant. She couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was steady, deliberate. Warren's hand reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a necklace made from dull copper wire strung with teeth, not human, but small animal teeth, each one polished until it gleamed faintly in the lamplight. He told her to put it on. The wire felt cold against her skin, the teeth resting like tiny stones at her collarbone. He said it was a wedding gift, a token to keep her safe from bad air and wandering spirits. She nodded because she knew that was expected of her, though she didn't understand what spirits had to do with a marriage. For a while, neither of them spoke. Warren lit a pipe, the smoke curling toward the low ceiling, staining the air with the scent of burnt tobacco and something sharper. Elsie May's thoughts wandered to the goat skin outside, hanging limp in the night
Subscribe to
air,
my
the
channel.
blood drying to a deep brown. She wondered if anyone had fed the chickens, or if the women downstairs had started boiling the soup for the morning meal. The normalcy of those thoughts felt strange, like they didn't belong in the same space as the quiet figure watching her from the cedar chest. When Warren finally stood, he moved toward her with the slow inevitability of a tide. He lifted her onto her feet and guided her toward the small window, where the glass was so old it warped the moonlight into ripples. He told her to look out, to see the land that was now hers. The hills rolled away into darkness, the tree line a jagged silhouette against the faint glow of the moon. He said it had been in their family for generations, that one day all of it would be passed down to her children. The word children made something in her chest tighten, though she didn't know exactly why. The next weeks blurred together into a strange routine. Warren slept in the upstairs room with her, though he spent most nights downstairs drinking with the older men. Elsie May was given new chores, ones that kept her close to the cabin and away from the boys. The women spoke to her less, their eyes skimming over her like she was no longer one of them, but something separate. Every few days, Warren would take her into the woods, showing her how to set traps for rabbits, how to follow the faint tracks of deer through the underbrush. He told her that learning to hunt was important because a wife who can feed herself can't be taken away. She didn't understand what he meant, but she nodded just the same. One cold morning, Warren announced that they would travel to the far side of the ridge to visit Ken. The path was steep, the frost crunching under their boots, and Elsie Mae's small hands went numb inside her thin gloves. When they arrived, the cabin they entered was darker and smaller than theirs, the air thick with the smell of unwashed wool. Inside were two women and a boy who looked barely older than Elsie Mae, his face pale and blank, his eyes glassy like the surface of a still pond. The women stared at her for a long moment before nodding to Warren. No words were exchanged. A pot of stew bubbled on the hearth, and the boy sat unmoving in the corner, his gaze fixed on the wall. Elsie Mae tried to speak to him, but he didn't answer, only blinked slowly as if the words couldn't reach him. That night, Warren explained in his low, gravelly voice that the boy was her cousin and brother both, the child of one of Warren's sisters and one of her own uncles. He spoke of the family's pure line as if it were something holy, something worth protecting no matter the cost. Elsie Mae listened without fully understanding, the firelight painting his face in shifting shadows. She thought of the boy's empty stare, of the way the women had looked at her, and a quiet unease settled in her stomach. Weeks turned into months, and the unease grew. Sometimes at night, she heard the older women whispering in the kitchen, their voices sharp and urgent. Once, she caught her mother's eyes across the room, and for a moment, she thought she saw pity there, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She began to dream of the ridge, of running up its slope and disappearing into the dark beyond, though she had no idea what lay on the other side. The joining, as her mother had called it, had not yet happened. But Warren grew more insistent, speaking in riddles about the bloodline, about duty, about the need to seal the bond before spring. Elsie Mae felt the weight of those words, even if she couldn't fully grasp their meaning. She knew something was coming, something that would change her forever, and that the family was waiting for it like the turning of the seasons. And in the still, breathless moments before sleep each night, she began to wonder if the land and the blood were the only things that mattered to them. What would they do to keep her from ever leaving?